buenas tardes a todos y todas por participar hoy en este nuevo webinar. Como bien sabemos, la relación entre la Unión Europea y la vecindad sur se enfrenta a muchos retos. Ahora mismo que se cumplen 10 años de las revueltas árabes y 25 años desde el proceso de Barcelona, es necesario hacer un balance precisamente de situación de la propia región junto con expertos, con expertas, con activistas, con la sociedad civil, organizaciones feministas, ecologistas, de cultura de paz, de derechos humanos, porque nuestro objetivo es proponer precisamente una nueva agenda para el Mediterráneo y la vecindad sur. Y es precisamente este el título del ciclo de webinarios para pensar una relación más justa y basada en derechos con la vecindad sur de la Unión Europea. En marzo ya celebramos el primer webinario de la serie con un balance de los 25 años de políticas de vecindad sur. Creo que hay un micrófono abierto, a ver si se puede... Quien está dirigiendo la reunión, a ver si se puede cerrar. Ya está. Decía... En marzo celebramos el primer webinario de la serie con un balance de los 25 años de políticas de vecindad sur de la Unión Europea. En marzo tuvimos un segundo webinario que lo titulamos Por un Mediterráneo de Derechos, donde pudimos contar con una orientación, un enfoque integral de derechos humanos con dos agentes de cambio muy importantes, los movimientos de mujeres y las organizaciones de defensa en los derechos humanos, que en el caso del mundo árabe obligan a no avalar precisamente a regímenes que violan los derechos humanos y reprimen precisamente a muchos de sus activistas. El último webinario trató sobre conflictos enquistados en nuestra vecindad, como son los casos de Palestina y del Sáhara Occidental, y en esa ocasión abordamos una nueva perspectiva también sobre la denuncia de la ocupación ante los tribunales para el acceso y el propio uso de los recursos naturales. Precisamente relacionado con esta última cuestión está el tema que vamos a abordar en el webinario de hoy, que es fronteras y recursos. Con este webinario lo que pretendemos analizar es precisamente cuáles son los intereses que se esconden detrás de una política europea hacia su vecindad sur, la relación con Turquía, incluyendo el control migratorio, pero también las prospecciones de gas, las fábricas textiles. También comentaremos qué es Frontex y qué papel juega en la estrategia de la Unión Europea para el Mediterráneo. Este último año se han sucedido varios acontecimientos que han tensionado aún más la relación entre la Unión Europea, Turquía, Grecia y Chipre. Y estos hechos se inscriben en la deriva autoritaria precisamente del régimen de Erdogan, que especialmente en 2016 ha intensificado la represión de los derechos políticos, de los derechos democráticos, económicos, que hemos ido siguiendo y denunciando desde el Parlamento Europeo, desde el encargo. Pese a las dos sentencias de derechos humanos, así como de otros diputados, diputadas, alcaldes, etcétera. Tanto como la represión a cualquier tipo de opositor político, de prensa, de defensores de derechos humanos, incluida la sección turca de Amnistía Internacional, en un deterioro muy grave y constante, cuyo último episodio hasta la fecha ha sido precisamente la retirada de Turquía del Convenio de Estambul contra la violencia de género. Erdogan en Libia, en Egipto, en otros, han sido precisamente motivo de preocupación para varios de los dirigentes europeos. Sin embargo, como decíamos, la relación de la Unión Europea con Turquía va más.
With Turkey goes beyond all of this, and they are a very important actor in neighborhoods in the southern region. And there are many things that go beyond this permanent conflict, this permanent diplomatic conflict, the quarrels at the European Parliament instigated by extreme right with their Islamophobic policies. We are talking about three very specific situations, and we want to put the limelight on them. First of all, the securitization of borders, using agreements with third countries to manage borders, like the agreement signed with Turkey as the epitome of a country with a situation that we know very well in Spain with our southern border. Secondly, there are many profits obtained by companies that have textile factories in countries such as Turkey and many other southern countries. There is a flagrant lack of labor rights in that country. We have a situation in Tangier. We have another example in Bangladesh. We can talk about many tragedies and labor accidents. Finally, there is an excessive surge for fossil fuel sources such as gas, oil in the Mediterranean, an area in situation of a climate emergency due to the increase of temperatures, the high level of desertification, and other phenomena that demand a real change of policies because, as you all know, we don't have a planet B. In order to discuss all of these things, we have the pleasure to introduce to you a series of speakers, such as Isiar Osoy from the Democratic Party of the People, Luis Miguel Hurtado, correspondent from El Mundo Enlacer in the Middle East. There is another microphone for Luisa Izuzquiza, coordinator of campaigns in Frachtenstadt, and Alejandra Ortega, responsible of Comisiones Obreras for Arab countries, Africa, and Asia. And finally, Naomi Kreitman, organizer in the Gastivist collectivity. Very good afternoon and welcome. Without further ado, we're going to give the floor to Itziar Otsoi. He has a lot to tell us about the situation in Turkey and everything pertaining to the political party, HDP. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for organizing this event, which is a good opportunity for us to exchange ideas about what is happening in Turkey with respect to the Kurdish question, the HDP, and the broader democratic situation in the country. You hear me, all of you, and also the interpretation is working? Just want to check that one before I proceed. Okay, thank you. So I have 8 to 10 minutes. There are so many things, but I need to really summarize. I will simplify certain things and put things in kind of general terms. And then in the Q&A session, we can definitely expand on some of the points that I will raise in my brief intervention. I think we should start by mentioning the peace process, which was in effect between 2013 and 2015, when there was formal dialogue between the Kurdish movement, the PKK-led Kurdish movement, and its jailed leader, Abdullah Öcalan, and the Turkish government. And for 2 years, there was kind of a climate of peace. But the expectation was that after June elections 2015, we would somehow finalize that process into actual peace. That unfortunately did not happen when the HDP entered the parliament by passing the 10% national election bar, which also prevented President Erdogan, for the first time since 2002, to form a majority government. It was precisely around that time when President Erdogan terminated the peace process, even before the June elections. In fact, he said that there was no Kurdish question, it was just a question of terrorism. That was, I believe, in April 2015. And since then, we have been in a vicious cycle of violence and repression against the HDP, the Kurds, and the broader democratic opposition in Turkey. You may remember in 2016, there was an attempted putsch, which was not successful, but President Erdogan used that attempted coup as a God's gift, in his own words, as a golden opportunity to declare emergency rule, to repress the opposition, and to establish something called the Turkish type presidential system, in which we don't have separation of powers and an independent judiciary, and President Erdogan and his ultra-nationalist, racist allies, they have created a political system in which the president mostly monopolized all legislative, executive, and judicial powers too, because now the president does have a lot of control over the judiciary. And in this process, over the last 5 to 6 years, the government has been using the judiciary as an instrument, as a political tool to repress the opposition, particularly the HDP. And I will tell you why HDP is the center of this crackdown, is the central target of this crackdown. Since 2015, more than 17,000 people were detained. I mean, these people belong to the HDP, either as members, administrators, mayors, members of parliament, our central executive board, our co-chairs. Almost everybody is in prison. And of course, this is done in the name of fighting terrorism. And in Spain too, you should be very familiar with these discourses somehow, and they happen too. Very recently, there was a debate. I will later talk about this. We had a debate at the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. And so, I mean, the right to self-determination for the Kurds is totally criminalized. Even demands for autonomy are severely criminalized, terrorized. So in this process, I mean, so many people were arrested, I said, detained, and a significant number of them, more than 5,000, they were arrested. They are still in jail. Probably that many people also left the country. They are mostly refugees in European countries. They are seeking political asylum there. So, and this crackdown is going on. And it is not just the HDP people, but there is a crackdown on the broader democratic public and civil society, trade unions, journalists, academia, universities. Almost anybody who is critical of President Erdogan and his racist allies is labeled as a traitor, enemy of the state, or a terrorist. So there is almost no space left for meaningful democratic political action in the country. And despite this repression, we increased our votes when compared with 2015 November elections. In 2018 June, we increased HDP's votes by 1%, despite all this repression and all these arrests. And in 2019 local elections, the HDP could reclaim many municipalities which were previously seized by the government, because there is also this tradition of removing our mayors, elected Kurdish mayors in Kurdish provinces, replacing them with government-appointed governors, which are state bureaucrats, and about 100 municipalities in 2016 and about 60 municipalities in 2019 after the elections. They were appointed qayyums, what's called qayyum, they're called trustees, but I mean, these are just mainly Turkish governors unlawfully replacing Kurdish mayors who are being sent to prisons. And many of them still are in prison. So, but as I said, despite all of these pressures in 2019 local elections, we were able to get back those Kurdish municipalities in southeastern Turkey, in Kurdistan part of Turkey. And at the same time, we didn't nominate any candidates in western provinces of Turkey, and we supported opposition candidates. So that pretty much destroyed Erdogan in Ankara, in Istanbul, in major cities in the Aegean and the Mediterranean provinces. And that way, we could show everybody that the HDP does have a very central role in Turkish politics and Kurdish politics. And we kind of have a kingmaker position. Still, we have that position. We are going to decide on the future of this country because we still get around 12 to 13, maybe more, I would say, of the national vote as we get closer to the elections. That is why President Erdogan and his allies is not just taking revenge. It's not just they are taking revenge from us, but because they know that in the presidential elections, if we repeat the scenario that we used in the local elections in 2019, that will be the end of President Erdogan's authoritarianism. So in that sense, there are two main court cases. One is called the Kobani case. The other is the closure case against our party launched at the Constitutional Court. In the Kobani case, the government is criminalizing both the resistance of Kobani in 2014 and HDP solidarity with that resistance when there were peaceful protests in 2014 when Kobani was under the siege of ISIS and Turkey was putting an embargo on Kobani. There were peaceful protests, but then the police started killing protesters. I mean, mainly HDP members. Dozens of HDP supporters were killed at the time. As the HDP, we asked for the establishment of parliamentary commission to investigate these murders. Of course, these proposals were refused by the AKP and MHP, which are the kind of governing coalition. And now, turning reality upside down and adding insult to injury. Our leaders, all of our leaders at the time, Central Executive Board members and our co-chairs, are being prosecuted for causing the murder of our own people. Okay? And they are asking like 37 counts of life sentence for each of our friends who are in prison now, including Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ. Second important case is, of course, the closure case, which was accepted by the Constitutional Court. And now we are in the process of writing our defense as a party. And they want to shut down HDP, and 451 politicians may be banned from politics. And also, in case of closure, of course, they will confiscate all the properties of the party. This is total destruction of the HDP before the elections. They are trying to do whatever they can, either to neutralize, to paralyze the HDP, and if the HDP insists on its political position, then to destroy it by shutting it down. But the good news is that all the charges raised against the HDP in the Kobani case, I think I need to wrap up, right? Okay, just give me one more minute and I'm done. So all the charges raised against the Kobani, in the Kobani and closure cases, these charges were already raised against our co-chair Selahattin Demirtas, and the European Court of Human Rights, its Grand Chamber, already reviewed all of these accusations and concluded that actually neither Demirtas nor the HDP involved in any kind of criminal activity, and the prosecution of the HDP is pretty much politically motivated. Okay, so it's not that we are under this much pressure, not because we committed some crime, but because politically we prevented Erdogan to consolidate his racist authoritarian rule, and we are still doing that. I gave you a lot of bad news. I know this is a very pessimistic thing, but then let me remind you that, I mean, we have come so far over the last 5 years. We have been continuing with our struggle. And I think politically speaking, despite all these pressures, we still do occupy a very, very central position. And our hope is that in the next elections, we will be able to kind of open new political space where we can reposition our forces for some meaningful democratic change in the country. In the Q&A session, maybe we can talk about the European position on it. I mean, while we do have a lot of support and sympathy within the European public, European Parliament and all the national parliaments, many national parliaments, Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. But when it comes to actual policy makers, European Union in particular, they do have more kind of, in quotation marks, real concerns. Obviously, they don't find democracy and human rights as real concerns. Migration, security, trade, these kinds of relationships, still they dominate their agenda, unfortunately, while very recently both the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe and the European Parliament, they made very strong statements on the closure case against the HDP. But we are expecting in this process, actually, all of the parliaments to put pressure on their governments, as well as the European Union and Commission, to take meaningful action with respect to all of these pressures against the HDP. To conclude, the attack on the HDP is not about an attack on a single political party and the 6 million people who we represent, voters who we represent. President Erdogan is trying to destroy the possibility of a democratic future in this country. And the HDP is the key to that democratic future. So in that sense, we want you to understand this attack on the HDP as not kind of something isolated, but it will have dramatic consequences for Turkey's relations with the European Union, Turkey's relationship in the Middle East, as well as the broader kind of Turkish and Kurdish struggles for a different country in Turkey. Let me stop here, and in the Q&A session, I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Isyar Otsoy. And I would just like to remind everyone who's listening to us that you can submit any questions you have so that we address them during the debate that we will be having afterwards. After having listened to this very interesting presentation, we also have Mr. Luis Miguel Hurtado, who's a freelance journalist, and he's going to share with us his experience regarding Turkey and the relations with the European Union. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Otsoy. I think your comments have been really relevant, and I will try to add on with some of my experiences. I'm going to share with you my views. I'm going to start by two different aspects that you might be familiar with. On the one hand, we very often talk about Turkey as an Eastern country, but we have to remember that Turkey has a strong influence in Europe, and it has always been a reference for European governments. So that's why all the different governments and the European institutions always have to bear that relationship in mind when shaping the relationship they want to have in the future and when negotiating with Turkey. I'm going to try to talk about the internal situation at the moment. We've been through a very difficult situation with situations such as the referendum of 2010. They've tried to adapt the laws of the country to the European legislation, but at the same time, the government of Erdogan has always moved towards totalitarianism, and we shouldn't forget, for example, the protests in 2010, the peace project with the PKK, as Mr. Otsoy also mentioned, and also all the very difficult situations that all the Kurdish peoples went through with attacks and many problems. And then there's also brought along a very tense situation with many different countries involved. We shouldn't forget the coup d'etat of 2010, which was the result of an internal conflict, whereas by part of a government that in Spain we could find similar to the Opus Dei in Spain. And as a result of that, there was a very intense persecution against all types of peoples, and I'm not only referring about people who were related to the coup d'etat somehow, but also they persecuted many other people. For example, the Kurd people who had nothing to do with the coup d'etat at all. They they went against them, and that was a very, very difficult situation. And this brings us to nowadays, where we have a situation where the red lines are still very clearly marked. And we've seen, for example, how intensively they've tried to declare illegal the HDP. We've also seen the non-ratification of the Istanbul Convention. And this all basically shows that at the current moment, we have a very difficult political situation. And the reason for this is mostly because of the economic circumstances. And that's something that has already been mentioned. The president is governing with a coalition with another very controversial party. And he also needs to find some sort of agreement with the other parties in place, so as to be able to govern somehow. And at the same time, we have certain indicators that, for example, for Europe, might seem to be positive when they're not. For example, when we talk about the growth rates, they represent a very high percentage of the GDP, and for example, we have a 13% of unemployment, which seems very positive if we compare that to the rates we have in Spain. But we also have to remember that the population in Turkey is very young, and we also have many cases of child labor, of very bad working relationships, and of work which is not decent. This is the result of a very strong policy which has been introduced in the country, which has had an impact, for example, in inflation, which is at a very high level at the moment, and it does not seem to improve at all. One of the reasons for the inflation we have is the monetary policy that has been introduced by the central bank, which has been very often put into question, where people very often are nominated because of different interests. And in order to try to bring inflation downwards, Erdogan has concentrated on a policy which basically says that by having very high interest rates, he can actually counter the inflation rate. And as a result of that, at the current moment, we have a very low degree of investment. People are consuming much more, and there is a growth rate which is present, but it is not real. We're talking about a country which is a producing country where the currency is increasingly losing value, and that is a very big problem. So as a result of all these different circumstances, the situation is becoming increasingly difficult for all the Turkish, especially because Erdogan usually had a lot of support, but very recently they've seen that the government is not able to overcome any of the obstacles they have. The government can no longer make use of all it used to do before. It cannot claim that it has problems and that it has to introduce different policies because of the interest it has. So that means that what they have been doing so far is no longer valid. And that is why we have to concentrate in the future. And in this sense, we have to concentrate on the collaboration we have from the different parties, collaboration which has had a very big impact on the way the government behaves. For example, very recently we have seen a certain support coming from certain areas of the country. We've seen, for example, how they behaved with HDP, which has had a very bad impact. And we also have to remember that the situation at the moment is also concentrating very clearly on the lack of rights of the population. In the Kurdish areas, after the HDP, we shouldn't forget that Erdogan is also one of the main political parties, and that's something that the European Union has to take into account. We have been trying to create an index taking into account the results of different surveys, and that's something that I would like to share with you because I think it's very interesting to see the results that we have achieved so far. As you can see on the screen, we can see how Erdogan is losing popularity in favor of the mayor of Ankara, Matsuyavas. This mayor does not mention the question of the Kurdish peoples. That is something which is completely out of the question. He comes from the CHP, and well, he's losing some votes, but he's very, very popular. And then we also have Soylu. I also have to mention them, and some of those were more critical with the Kurdish situation. We can see how they're losing votes also as a result of the recent videos which have been published, which mainly take out into the light everything they have been doing. And I would also like to talk about the relationship that they have with the European Union, but we shouldn't forget everything that is happening at the moment. I know that we have different discussions going on at a European level, and we are trying to think about how we can actually address and negotiate with Turkey. But I think it is also been very important for us to bear in mind how the Turkish people see the European Union. In this sense, the University of Turkey has very recently published a report, which I'm also going to share with you on the screen. It is basically this graph. So when you ask, when you ask to the Turkish people which of the following represents Turkey the best, the first thing they always mention is the European Union. So they believe it is a European country, as you can see, more than around, as you can also see, this is also something which is also very frequently the answer of all the different parts of the country. I mean, even voters of the HDP and all the different parties, they all recognize themselves as a European country. Then they have also asked them if they support Turkish full membership in the European Union. You can compare here the results from some years ago until nowadays, and you will see that the country is very often clearly in favor of the becoming part of the European Union. You can see the results of the AKP, of the CHP, of the MHP. Even the most centralist parties still have the same results. And something which is also very interesting as a result of this report is, in what ways do you think that Turkey would benefit from European membership? The first thing is something which might be obvious, economic standards. They've seen how the different European countries have responded, for example, to the crisis of the COVID and the last crisis we had. But they also mentioned very often that they believe that human rights would improve. And they also mentioned democracy, or also that it would be easier for them to travel or to find a job. And the last one that I would like to share with you is this one we have on the screen, which basically reflects how the frustration they feel when they think about becoming a full member of the European Union. As I have mentioned before, this is something that they would like to do, but they do not really believe they will actually become a full member. And this is precisely where the European Union comes into action. I have another graph that I will not be sharing with you, where they asked them why they believe that the European Union is not that willing to accept Turkey as a member. And very often they answered that they believed it was because of religion, because of a cultural difference. But others also mentioned that there was a problem with the rule of law and with democracy. So basically, I just wanted to mention that if we don't take into consideration the the political background, most of them want to be part of the European Union, and they still feel they have strong connections with Europe. And well, this is where we have to start from if we want to have a debate. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing with us so many data and so many information. I'm going to move on then to Saurkitha, who's a campaign coordinator at Frankdenstad. And I would like to ask you, because you're an expert in Frontex and you're very familiar with everything that has to do with European borders and border control. This is something that we very often talk about in the European Parliament. Can you please share with us your views? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to be here with you today and to participate in this very interesting debate. As Idoia already mentioned, I coordinate campaigns in Frankdenstad, which is a German organization, which basically concentrates on freedom of information and speech. And as she also mentioned, we try to use all the transparency laws that we have in the European Union in order to address the rights of the people that have to do with the borders. And we concentrate very often, for example, on Frontex. And the reason why we have decided to concentrate on Frontex is because we decided that this was something that was very necessary. Frontex is one of the main agencies of the European Union, and it has created its own ecosystem around the European Union borders by trying to put an end to all the information they share with the other countries. So it is very, very difficult to have any sort of data on Frontex, and even more when we talk about information on the ground. So that means that we have no indicators as to its capacity. We have no way to do a follow-up of what they are doing. We also have to bear in mind that this is probably the most powerful agency that we have in the European Union, but it's not transparent at all. Its current budget is 5 billion euro. And in the future, it will even have its own guards to guarantee peace in the borders, people who will be armed. And since a couple of years ago, it also has the ability of acquiring its own equipment, helicopters, planes, and even high technology that they can use to control the borders. For example, detectors of carbon dioxide and so on. It is also an agency which is present in over 15 countries. So not only in the European Union borders, but also in third countries, for example, Turkey, which you have mentioned before, but also in many other countries in Africa, such as Niger or Senegal. And on top of that, it has this operational arm, but it also has presence in many other countries where it tries to coordinate different activities. And that's why it's also present in all the countries of the European Union. And it is also key when it comes to developing technologies in order to control and monitor our borders. So that means that since 2005, when this agency was created, until nowadays, we have basically seen how they created a massive machine of border control, which is not transparent at all, which is not accountable for what it does, and which creates a very difficult situation. As a result of this expansion of Frontex without control, we have seen how it has very actively participated or collaborated in serious human rights violations in Italy, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. We also have to remember how it has also contributed with and collaborated, for example, with the Coast Guards from Libya, and it has also participated in very critical operations, for example, all which has to do with the defense, which is located in the borders. We have very big companies that Frontex is working with in order to develop and research new technologies, which actually contribute to put into risk human lives and to capture, for example, and bring together data of people. So I think that given the current situation, it is very important to concentrate on Frontex and on the lack of transparency. This is something that is not acceptable. We are trying to work, therefore, in order to try to make sure that transparency is always guaranteed, and we try to combat Frontex and all Frontex represents. So that's why we say the more we know about Frontex, about the people it works with, the more information we will have, and the more accurate we will be when trying to put some resistance to this system that has been introduced, and the better options we will have to find alternatives to the current situation. I think it is also very important, and this will bring me to the end of my presentation, that we always need to bear in mind that Frontex has also has negative impacts. We talk about transparency, violation of human rights, violence, but this is something which cannot be understood as the flaws of a system that works. So we cannot say that Frontex was meant to work and it does not work anymore. So we need to put some patches so that it works again. But we believe that the Frontex is actually working as it should be working, and that the system itself is flawed. Frontex has had very, very negative impacts. Some of them have been very clearly these last few years. And that's a result of the fact that border control always comes hand in hand with human rights violations, with violence, and with everything that Frontex has brought into the picture. So that's why we believe that we need to do something, and we need to address everything from a structural perspective. And we are also part of an agency which defends the fact that Frontex should be dissolved. We reject any existence of border control. We reject the very existence of Frontex. We believe that that is something that we do not need to transform. We basically need to make sure we eliminate it entirely because of the very bad impact it has. Many people are being hurt, many people are dying as a result of Frontex, and we need to find alternatives in order to guarantee human rights, in order to guarantee justice and the rule of law for everyone. So, well, in this context, there's many other things that I could share with you, but I would just like to start by this introduction. If you have any questions or comments, I will be very happy to address them.
Thank you very much, Luisa. It's very interesting to understand the different perspective of the southern neighborhood and Frontex role. And we see every day the different way that they are repressed in a territory. We're going to listen to Alejandra Ortega, responsible at Comisiones Obreras, in charge of the Arab countries, Africa and Asia. She's going to tell us about labor rights and give us a general perspective in Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, countries that do not offer many rights for Europe. So you have the floor, Alejandra, for 10 minutes. Very good afternoon. And first of all, I would like to thank the invitation given by Doña Villanueva, an invitation to Comisiones Obreras for this final webinar on southern neighborhood. But before I start, I would like to tell you that I have sent a more detailed presentation of what I will tell you right away, and it is at your disposal if you want to read it, and I can also exchange emails with you. You have my email address in the presentation. In my 10 minutes, I will try to give you some broad lines about the situation pertaining to labor rights and trade union freedoms in the region, and I will tell you about some proposals and ideas that can help improve future strategies. For that, I will refer myself to the recently published Global Index of Rights from the ITUC. This is a yearly report of the ITUC. The conclusions of this index are available for the past few weeks, and you can read in detail the different cases between theory and practice, violation of rights by governments and companies, and situation in 149 countries. So what does this index tell us about the situation in the world? In a general way, and at a first glance, this 8th edition of the index tells us that the 10 worst countries in the world for workers are Bangladesh, Belarus, Brazil, Colombia, Egypt, Philippines, Honduras, Myanmar, Turkey, and Zimbabwe. Turkey, as we have said before, and Egypt. These two have been mentioned this afternoon. And by regions, once again, in a recurrent manner, every year, the worst region in the world still remains Middle East and the north of Africa. In a general way, the index says that 87% of countries vulnerate the right to go on a strike, 79% the right to have collective bargaining, 74% vulnerates the right to establish and affiliate to a trade union, 65% of the cases, workers don't have access to justice. From 89 to 109 is the number of countries that bans the creation of trade unions. Many attacks took place against the working class in more than 45 countries. The number of countries where freedom of expression was restricted went from 56 to 64, and trade union leaders were murdered in Brazil, Colombia, Philippines, Guatemala, Myanmar, and Nigeria. In those statistics, the countries of the southern neighborhood take the worst deal, especially Egypt and Turkey. This would be the general framework to start with when we want to imagine strategies and solutions. So what is the situation of international conventions of ILO for this region and labor legislation? We must say that all countries of that area are members of the ILO. They have developed labor legislations and have ratified international conventions of the ILO, especially those that have to do with freedom of association, collective bargaining, elimination of forced work, child work, and discrimination of work. However, we know that for many decades, the ILO and ITUC reports talk about the severe banning of the right to strike, to collective bargaining, the right to go organized from a trade union perspective. In the past years, the economic claims have associated ever more with the political claims shared with other social movements and opposition groups, and they have operated in a progressive transformation of Arab trade unions. But what are the main challenges? The effective enforcement of the current labor legislation and the current labor regulations. To make foreign investment subject to social clauses, respect of human rights and opportunities, no child work, defense of salaries, compensations, pensions, etc. The defense of trade union rights in multinationals. The freedom to create trade unions and non-discrimination of migrant workers in these countries where forced work is still a reality. We talk about slavery and forced work. Trade union independence without governmental interference. In pretty much all countries, political parties and the government try to manipulate trade unions. At the same time, another important challenge is social dialogue. The main employer is no longer the state in the region and has been replaced by private businessmen. Trade unions have the challenge to establish themselves in the private sector and in multinationals. There is a need of a new tripartite negotiation model and the generalization of collective bargaining. Finally, a very important challenge is the incorporation of women and youth into political spaces and trade union structures. It must be said, because in most of the countries, this is not yet a reality. In this scenario, I would like to bring forward a couple of elements that have been former European Union strategies for the region and some proposals for a better future. For us, it is obvious that the EU strategy towards Mediterranean countries hasn't really fulfilled its initial objectives in the so-called Barcelona process. There were ulterior strategies that didn't achieve a goal in the same way. But not everything is negative. However, relationships have been characterized by a close relationship with dictatorial regimes and a high tolerance to police regimes and authoritarian regimes. For example, this is the case of the Union for the Mediterranean with 28 countries and 15 countries to the south and east of the Mediterranean, and the headquarters are in Barcelona. However, these specific initiatives and projects do not include or mention matters pertaining with economic rights and labor rights and trade union freedoms. This is alarming if we take into account the data I gave you at the beginning. Facing this reality, we have a couple of proposals, but I don't think this is any news to you because everything has been already invented, but we can mention a few, such as activate and innovate strategies that want to go more in depth in the analysis of what is happening at the southern border of the EU. We're talking about SDGs, decent work, the Agenda 2030, and international labor standards. The ILO has been working on this since 2019, so this is not anything new. We want to include in an effective way the trade union movement with national consultations. We want to activate the social dialogue. We want to boost the social dialogue in the European Union and the Mediterranean, which has been blocked until now. There is a non-functioning structure. Then we have to enforce the international standards to which all members of the ILO are subject to. And to sum up, strategies cannot ignore the deep causes that were at the origin of in the previous decade of the protest calling for freedom, equality, and social justice in our southern neighborhood and in many other parts of the world. But we must have learned something. Thank you very much for this invitation, and I am at your disposal for the Q&A session. Thank you, Alejandra. We are very, very lucky with this panel because you present different perspectives, different angles, so we have a clearer view of the reality. And now it is the turn of Naomi Craigman, an organizer of the Castivets collectivity. Naomi, you're going to tell us about the situation in the oil field and the situation between Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, very important from the resources point of view. Everything that has to do with gas, oil, and essential resources, and the EU relationship with the countries of the southern neighborhood. Naomi, you have the floor.
Thank you. And also feeling lucky. It's really nice to be here in this conversation with you all. So I work in a collective called the Gastivists, and we focus on supporting the resistance against new gas projects in Europe. I'll start with a general overview and then zoom in on the East Med gas situation, and then a bit about what we at the Gastivists think we can do about it. So on the global level, the fossil fuel industry is feeling the pressure to move away from oil and coal. There seems to be enough political consensus that they're bad. And so it's holding on to gas as its lifeline. Gas is incredibly damaging to communities, the people who live around infrastructure and extraction, and also it's terrible for the climate. It's just terrible in a bit of a different way to oil and coal. But the industry makes a huge effort and has been very successful in their lobbying to have politicians think that it's better and that it's part of the energy solution. And apart from being a disaster for the climate and local environment, which brings all sorts of impacts for people, it also has massive geopolitical impacts and human rights impacts, especially in the East Mediterranean region. And the people at the EU Commission, when we talk to them about this, raise their hands and say, we're not politicians. This is about energy, and that's different to politics and human rights. So this is a political space that needs more work, needs more power, and we really invite people to step into, because too often it's political work on one side and energy on the other, and obviously they're incredibly connected. So the EU is really supporting a massive new wave of gas projects. There's, I believe, around 220 either planned or in construction. 55 projects right now, fossil gas projects, have EU priority status and access to public money. A few years ago, the biggest loan ever in European history, 1.5 billion, went to a pipeline that would take gas from Azerbaijan to Italy. Like, there's a lot of political power going into this. And I was reading a bit the EU Mediterranean strategy and some documents in preparation from here, and there's so little mention of fossil fuels. They talk about clean energy and they talk about hydrogen, which I'll talk about a bit about later, but fossil gas, there's so much political power going into it. And in these documents about their Mediterranean strategy, they know that they should keep quiet about it. So there's space here for accountability and to raise this. So the EastMed pipeline is, it's a plan right now that there are studies going on and they're trying to get finance, but it's not in construction yet. It is a pipeline that would go from offshore, taking from gas fields under Israeli control to take that gas through Cyprus, through Greece to Italy for a Western European market. And this is one huge, ridiculous example. It would be super expensive. It would be one of the longest in the world. It would be the deepest ever built. It's a really ridiculous project. So we use it as a way to start conversations. But there's more gas infrastructure all over the region. A liquid gas terminal planned for Cyprus, planned for Greece, that got 166 million from the EU a few weeks ago. So I'm talking about this pipeline because it's a good example, but actually there's infrastructure and extraction all over the region. So it's good to use this pipeline as a way in, but not to focus too much on this. This pipeline is sold absurdly as a solution for peacekeeping. The Israeli discourse, for example, the Cypriot discourse, is that it will bring peace to the region. It'll bring regional players together. It's sold as a climate solution, and it's sold in the EU as a solution for energy security. For peacekeeping, this is absurd. We see that it's escalating the conflicts between Greece and Turkey, the disputed waters. Obviously, this has been a problem for decades. But now that there's a big financial incentive to drill, to get the gas out of those disputed waters, of course it escalates. And I think it was either last summer or the summer before, there was a research vessel and a naval vessel colliding. And still the EU Commission raises its hands and says, no, it's just an energy project for energy security. And so it really shows whose security are we talking about here? The implications of escalating these tensions are that fragile peacekeeping efforts in Cyprus between the northern Turkish and southern Greek-speaking communities are made more difficult, and they're fragile already. This pipeline would secure a market for Israeli-controlled gas. So it's our Palestinian allies want, this is the EU legitimizing the Israeli regime, the apartheid state, strengthening the Israeli government. And I think also important to share here, the US is supporting all sorts of gas projects in the Eastern Mediterranean region in the same deal, the same bill, in which they give military support, like joint naval exercises, joint drone trainings, and it's in a bill, the Energy and Security Bill, and Exxon lobbied for it. And so, of course, if Exxon lobbied for it in the US, of course, they're involved in what's happening in Brussels. And still, this project is moving ahead. Then on the climate side, this is total greenwashing. As I said before, gas is not a climate solution. If anyone's interested in more details, I can direct you to more resources. I'm not going to go into it now. But climate change, of course, exacerbates all the security risks that are already there. And being able to access the green recovery funds and things like this is a technique that's just keeping fossil fuel companies in power, keeping the status quo of an extraction-based centralized energy model in power. And such projects are being used more as geopolitical tools, pawns on a chessboard, under the disguise that it's about providing clean energy and energy security for civilians. But civilians' lives are not going to be made better by more fossil gas projects. So what we can do about it is fill this political space, scandalize the fact that energy projects that have access to public money, that are getting a lot of political support. There's policies such as the PCI list, projects of common interest, the 10E policy that is how priority status for energy projects is determined, that stay in this nerdy little world where people pretend it's apolitical. And we need to scandalize the fact that political power is going into these projects that are escalating geopolitical conflicts, and the people running these processes raise their hands and say, this is not political. So yeah, we ask for your help in finding ways to do this and ways to intervene. We need to champion the real energy solutions that will actually bring security and not escalate existed or create geopolitical tensions and strengthen apartheid states. So things like community-run, real renewable solutions. Hydrogen energy is being used right now as a huge smokescreen. There's a lot in the EU Mediterranean strategy actually about hydrogen. And hydrogen energy is really one that we need to be careful with. It's energy that needs energy to be produced. So hypothetically, renewables could be used to create hydrogen energy. But we're not seeing that happen. That's just being used as an excuse, saying, okay, we'll build this super expensive, super deep mega pipeline right from where Israeli gas fields are to Europe. But probably one day we'll make hydrogen using solar and carry it through that pipeline. So it's fine. Like it's really a trick that we can't have our politicians falling for. So yeah, at the from a Gastivist perspective, we really invite you to get in touch. Happy to share resources. We really believe in the power of connecting. A lot of the work we've been doing about the EastMed pipeline is connecting people along the route of the pipeline or in countries or places that are involved otherwise. And so invite you to get in touch, to connect. We really believe in the power of connecting across movements and across regions. And finally, for our friends in Spain, on the 27th of August, there is a climate camp, so camping and workshops in Galicia, in a site where an LNG terminal is planned to be built. So it's a wonderful place to learn more about this fight, the struggle, to connect with people. and I can share in the chat the link. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naomi. So we accept your invitation, of course. And as I said before, we have many different perspectives, different views. At the very beginning, we talked about the way in which Erdogan is monopolizing the legislative and the judicial power, as well as and how they are basically prosecuting all the opposition parties and many other persons in the country in order to try to have a clearer position and be better positioned for the elections. And we also mentioned the fact that what he's actually jeopardizing is democracy itself. We also have Mr. Hurtado, who has mentioned that Turkey at the very beginning had Europe as a reference, and that is why many people in Turkey still refer to the European Union as something that they refer to in their daily lives. He also mentioned what happened in 2010 and the coup d'etat in 2016, and we have also seen how Turkey decided not to continue the Istanbul Convention. We've also been informed about the rights, the violation of labor rights and the amount of child work and forced labor, which is increasing, and very often that is being taken to court. And when it comes to the society, we have a mixed reality where on the one hand, we have the economy, and on the other hand, we have democracy and rights, and the fact that many citizens believe that things would actually improve if they were to join the European Union, but at the same time they also believe that they will never become full members of the European Union. We've also heard Luisa, who's talked about Frontex, which is a very opaque agency of the European Union, is not transparent at all, and it's receiving billions of euros every year. In 2005, when it was created, it was a new agency, and right now it's basically a giant, a massive machine of border control, where there's no accountability at all, and which very often collaborates with other which other parties, for example, from Libya, was something that we have seen in the news very recently. So that is why we need to make sure that we actually can control what they are doing. Alejandra also mentioned the information we have about labor rights in the world, and the fact that Egypt and the north of Africa are probably the worst countries in the world. We have no social dialogue at all. Women are not included in the labor market, and slavery is it's taking place on a daily basis, and the European Union very often does not take into account all these realities, and when negotiating its trade policies. And finally, we've had Naomi, who mentioned that fuel, and especially fossil fuel, and has had a very bad impact on the environment, but very often this is something which is totally neglected, and nobody takes into account the impact that the projects, for example, gas projects of the European Union has on the environment. And in this context, we have the EastMed project, which is a very big one that we have to follow closely. And this will bring even more tensions to Israel, Palestine, and Turkey. And we also have to bear in mind the fact that the United States are also supporting the creation of this pipeline. So this is something that we have to follow very closely, because of course, when we talk about climate change, this is something that also has an impact, but it also brings along certain political impacts that we shouldn't forget. And now let's move on to our Q&A session. We have a couple of questions that people have shared with us. For example, one of it says, I was wondering which are the reasons why the European Union is not taking any action to combat the repression of HDP, and which are the countries in Europe which support or are more in favor of Erdogan's regime and why? And also, how can the European Union make sure that we have free and democratic elections in Turkey? For Luis, they've asked if you believe that the civil unrest will increase during the elections, and if you believe that Erdogan's policy will continue having a very big impact on the relationship with the European Union, for example, as it has happened with Cyprus, and also bearing in mind the pipeline. And they also ask about Frontex, and this one's for Luisa, and if you know how the different countries contribute to funding Frontex, and how we can actually make sure that Frontex is accountable for what it does. There's what you have mentioned reminds us of what's happening between the United States and Mexico, and they were also wondering if you could have more information that you can refer us to so that we have more data. And well, we've had several webinars. As I mentioned before, we work together with sglobal.es, where you can also have access to all the previous documentation and presentations that we have seen in the previous webinars. But let's dwell into the questions we have. Very interesting questions, and maybe Azoy, you can start and take the floor. Mr. Azoy.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you again. Yeah, I mean, the two questions are mainly about the EU-Turkey relations and what Turkey can specifically do to at least make sure we have some free, fair elections in Turkey. I mean, I was, when listening to Naomi about the kind of European Commission's approach to this gas drillings and all these kinds of problems, climate issues, that they tend to say that, oh, these are all technical issues, right? Which are in fact deeply political. And so we have kind of a similar situation when we deal with the European institutions. For example, we do have a quite big support in the European Parliament, right, which represents the people. And I think the European community, European public is very much sympathetic to our case, that they know what is happening to the HDP. And everybody is saying that something should be done to stop this onslaught. But when it comes to the European Union and Commission, as I said, they work on kind of different agendas with Turkey. One is definitely the borders and migration and security. And when you approach these people, they say these are all technical issues again, right? These are not technical issues. These are political issues created because of political conflicts mostly, and they are managed through a lot of political processes. So the European Union, the European Commission, the leader of the European Commission, you may remember, on June 21st, the very day when the Constitutional Court accepted the indictment against the HDP for the closure of the party, that very day, she posted a Twitter message saying that they had a wonderful dialogue and conversation with President Erdogan, and they discussed so many issues, okay, including Eastern Mediterranean, but no mentioning of democracy and human rights and the HDP. I mean, it's very interesting to see that, while they keep bragging about how they value democracy and human rights, when it comes to Turkey, nobody cares about democracy and human rights, to put it very simply, okay? We have been trying to communicate with, for example, Mr. Borrell himself, I want to say here because it's Spain, right? We have been trying to reach him, and he is so scared of even communicating, to put it very bluntly. While in the past, we have had a lot of communication with EU leaders, but despite the fact that he's actually a member of the Party of European Socialists, of which the HDP is a member too, but still, I mean, because they are dealing with, in quotation marks, more important issues like as I said, migration, like border control, like, you know, those kinds of issues. Plus, Turkey is a member of the NATO, and Turkey is trying to address some of the security challenges faced by the European Union. So our main argument mainly is for the Europeans that democracy and human rights and rule of law, these are not just nice, fancy words. A stable Turkey where there is respect for democracy and human rights will be the most important contribution to Europe's security. So the question of democracy and rights, we think, is intimately tied into politics of security in Europe as well. So a stable, democratic, and free Turkey will definitely serve security interests of the European Union. This is what we are trying to communicate. I would say that other than some techno-politics represented in the EU Commission and the EU itself, the majority of people in the European countries, they see, I mean, the situation in Turkey. When it comes to taking action, you know, we have all kinds of excuses. But we have to deal with the migration. But we have to this. We know Erdogan is a dictator. We know actually he's like 1930s Germany. I mean, you know, behind closed doors. But then all of a sudden, when Erdogan threatens them with more refugees, or, you know, and then they somehow in a miserable situation. I think the European position was really, really miserable. Sometimes I tell them, actually, it is so interesting that, I mean, we HDP people, despite all this repression and arrest and everything, we are not scared of Erdogan. But all these European leaders, they are all scared of Erdogan. It's so fun to watch them. When Erdogan gets angry, all of them, they start trembling and shaking. Go, give him more money, so we need to stop this migration and this and that. Angela Merkel is the key person here, and I think also some Spanish bureaucrats in the European Union too. I mean, they are actually having a very anti-democracy, anti-human rights agenda when it comes to Turkey. At the level of discourse, they always talk about human rights and democracy, but they don't really care about these kinds of issues. What can be done with respect to fair and free elections? Of course, it's not just about the safety of ballot boxes on the day of elections. I mean, President Erdogan has been gradually destroying the democratic society, the civil society, and the HDP. And if they shut down the HDP, I mean, we can't even talk about elections, right? I mean, a party is being shut down, a party that represents 6 million people, and a party whose prosecution in Turkey was considered by the European Court of Human Rights as totally politically motivated. Okay, so the European leaders, not just to help us in Turkey, but for the future security of Europe, member states, and the Union as a whole, it is to their interests to support a democratic, peaceful, pluralistic Turkey, which we think would greatly serve to the interests of the European Union. It is up to them. We will be continuing with our struggle, but unfortunately, when it comes to the European Union and the European Commission, we are not, unfortunately, very optimistic. And in that particular context, we want our colleagues at the European Parliament to put more and more pressure on the bureaucracy of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Asier. Just mentioned that all that has to do with Erdogan will continue having an impact on the European Union. And how do you see this within the context of the pipelines that we have mentioned? Well, before we dwell into that, I think there's something that we have to mention, which is the risk of having some sort of turmoils, of some sort of unstable situation during the elections. Well, in 2013, nobody could have thought that what happened was going to happen. So being a journalist myself, I would say that everything's possible. people in Turkey are very resilient. That's something that I have seen myself on the ground. And this is something that we also have to bear in mind, taking into account that they have recently gone through a very severe pandemic. We believe that it is quite difficult for turmoils to happen right now, but we never know given the current circumstances. When it comes to the European Union, we have certain countries, for example, Cyprus and Greece, which oppose to Turkey. They even want to sanction Turkey because of the pipeline, because of the policies. For example, they say that they want to overcome the barriers set in 2004. Spain, however, is a little bit more assertive because it believes that Turkey is a very important actor, but it also mentions that it is very important to discuss everything, to negotiate. And Spain believes that being able to negotiate certain things with Turkey can also bring along other negotiations, for example, regarding human rights or human rights violations. That's something that they very often tell us, that they will be negotiating that at a later point. So they try to have some sort of access point and start negotiating. And then after that, they want to discuss human rights and other aspects. When it comes to the economy, I think that it is very important to bear in mind that when Turkey has economic problems, it needs to have foreign investment. And this is something that has very clearly reduced itself. When you go through turmoils, people have fear, and that's why they no longer invest in certain countries. And very recently, for example, all the different vessels which were involved in prospection for the pipelines have been taken back to the ports. So investment has also been reduced in this context. In the future, we might be able to address all the different issues, one of the main ones being, of course, human resources. I've been there in Iran for 4 years, and I have had an experience myself in that country, in Iran, right after the sanctions, when there was a sort of opening towards the European Union. However, my feeling was that as a result of the sanctions, the Iranians have really suffered, not only because of the sanctions, of course, but very often also because of the way in which the government has managed the entire situation and the sanctions themselves. So the situation has not been positive at all to the citizens of the country. So when we think about Turkey, I would bear this in mind when thinking about sanctions. People very often tend to request sanctions, but I think that we shouldn't forget that Turkey is not Erdogan. Turkey is a political system which has evolved in the later years. Of course, the balance of power is completely unequal. There's a lot of things at risk. The electoral processes, however, have been identified by the OSCE as transparent somehow, although they also recognize that all public campaigns and public campaigning always concentrates on the power, on the government in power, and gives no voice at all to the other political parties. We've also seen everything that has happened against the HDP very recently. One person was murdered in the very building of the HDP. So this is something that we shouldn't forget. But above all, Turkey is much more than that. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And before we go into the question regarding Frontex, I would like to ask Alejandra, which are the Spanish and European companies which are related to violation of human rights. How can the European Union control all those companies which are present in the south? How can they actually guarantee that they respect human rights, that they have, that they respect all power relationships? And also, we were wondering if you think that clean energies can have an impact, be it positive or negative, in the political relationships we have with certain countries. Thank you. As for how Frontex is funded and how the different countries contribute to funding Frontex, I'll go into that very quickly. Frontex has its resources directly from the European Union. That's where, for example, it has this 5 billion euros that I referred to before, which are going to be used to fund all its activities until 2027. This is something that has been approved by all the different European countries, but also on top of that, it also has access to certain fundings coming from the European Union. For example, it has certain resources which are allocated to security, peace, and border keeping. One of them is the so-called, and I'm not sure about the name, the Fund for Border Management, Luisa says, which is a fund where all the different European countries can contribute, and then Frontex can access that funding for equipment or for whatever it needs to fund. And then we can also have the European countries, but also countries which are not part of the European Union, but are part of the Schengen area, which can also contribute to Frontex by giving them staff and equipment. I mentioned that in 2019, it was also given green light to be able to buy its own equipment out of its own budget, something which was not the case until now. But this is going to take some time. We believe that until 2027, it will not be able to fund all the equipment it needs. So that's why up to now, all the different countries have been contributing with resources, vessels, boats, helicopters, and of course with coast guards and all sorts of staff, something which is also very important to bear in mind, because if we want to actually monitor everything that's happening and the contribution of the different countries to Frontex, that is one of the main points of access we have in order to know what resources it has and how it is using them.
This is a campaign for the past year. It has the participation and involvement of many associations from all fields of immigration and pretty much all member states of the EU and countries outside of the EU too. And this is the tip of the iceberg for Frontex. The abolition wouldn't be an end on itself, but a roadmap with specific stages towards the creation of an alternative system to a system of border control and repression of migrants. In this sense, the campaign is structured in 9 demands drafted by organizations, experts. Some are addressed to the dismantling of these structures, highly toxic and generating violence, leading to the death of thousands of people at the border. And some demands tackle abolition from a perspective of building alternatives. One demand is the abolition of Frontex, including suspension of operations, how member states should withdraw certain contributions, how to reject expansions to the national territory, as is the case in Spain, to expand the presence of Frontex in the national territory. And more constructive proposals towards the generation of rights and security understood as the security of everybody, regularizing migrants, making alternatives, rescue at sea, etc. And if you're interested in getting to know more about Frontex and these proposals, the website of the campaign is only in English today, but it will be available in Spanish. abolishfrontex.org. I can put a link in the chat for the participants. And if you scroll down, you can see many resources with links to reports, press releases, etc. on Frontex. And for each of the 9 petitions of the campaign, there is specific information to understand how the system will work, what research has been made until now, etc. So I hope this can be useful for everybody. Yes. We have put the link in the chat. Alejandra and Noemi. Yes, there are many questions made by the same person. So this will be enough content for future webinars. Idoia. And I apologize because I will have to reply in record time. But you can contact me per email and we can follow up on this conversation. We need to take into account the extreme fragility of the countries that we are talking about. This has been exacerbated by elements that we are all acquainted with, which has to do with the severe sanitary crisis that we are going through. The fall of consumption, the big brands have faced an important liquidity crisis, suspension, cancellation of orders, with a big impact in the labor market and massive redundancies. Taylor talks about more than 300 million people that have lost their employment in the formal economy, 300 million. And I don't give figures concerning those who stopped having a full-time job and have now a part-time job. Only in the textile sector, a few months ago, we were talking about more than 40 million people. And this affects people such as Morocco, that was mentioned after the tragic accident, Tarakeh. And in the case of Egypt, the situation is critical. This is a very feminized sector with a big impact on women that are exposed to a double violence, also harassment at work. This has had an impact in the trade union activity with a massive redundancy of trade unionists. This has been the case in Turkey, in Egypt, in 2018, before the pandemic. All trade union activities, all independent trade unions in Egypt were dismantled, and we only have the officialist trade union of the regime. And this is the situation. In the case of Egypt, the closures of factories in big industrial areas such as Mahal and Korea, with important textile companies. And this is the scenario. So how can we control multinationals? The big question in the Southern Mediterranean is, should there be a legislation? I replied to this when I mentioned the challenges. And one of the new formula, these have to be implemented in practice. So parliaments need to make sure that this is a reality, that they don't turn their attention somewhere else. In most countries, the labor legislations do not correspond with the ILO standards. I'm not saying that we need to have a multinational legislation and human rights legislation, but we have more than 100 years of history, and this is not being fulfilled. And an international labor standard doesn't seem to be compulsory. Even at those ILO conventions that are considered to be essential, and when they are violated, it is very hard to make sure that they are implemented. To make foreign investment subject to respecting the rights, to abolishing child work, eradication of forced work in all countries. And the Syrian refugees in Turkey, this is not only child work, this is also forced work, minor marriages and atrocities that we know when they are happening there to a bigger or lesser extent. The defense of the trade union rights in multinationals, if those areas if I can't create a trade union in a special area, then I don't have access in those free zones. In the case of Morocco, the trade union in Morocco has access to the information about a certain company, but I don't want to put names. But maybe they don't have access to this information in the free zones. And this is part of the problem. The lack of freedom to create a trade union is essential if I don't have the capacity to have a control mechanism, or if I don't have a capacity to denounce the situation of violation of fundamental rights, then things will be very tricky. And this naturally has an impact on the labor market in the southern countries and also an impact in the north. We shouldn't be naive. This is not something happening only in a little workshop of Tanger, if they were unlucky enough, as they were, and we have seen this in Bangladesh, in a beverages company. So we need to launch mechanisms that revive these international standards, the international framework agreements, and in the core of all of it, we need to remember that decent work is a term used by the ILO for many years. So decent work has been at the core of it all. Authorities and politicians have the obligation to talk about this in their documents. In the African case, I have read in many occasions documents by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Spain in their African plan. The first reading is not the 400 pages, but a PDF document. I make a research, work, trade union, labor rights. It doesn't appear a single time. It is unheard of that from a ministry, a political party, or just any structure, these matters are not mentioned because the violation of human rights is automatic and systematic. And if I haven't answered to all your questions, please contact me per email. Thank you very much, Alejandra. Naomi.
Thank you. So I have two questions, one about hostility on the EU border and one about gas and climate. I'll do my best in a few minutes, and also invite questions, emails, or checking out the Gastivist website. There's a lot of resources there. About hostility to refugees, I think what I can add to the conversation from my work is the huge impact of climate change on the refugee crisis in so many ways. Makes extreme weather events that make destroy villages, that make dwelling uninhabitable, that's made more likely. There's food crises because the weather is changing. There's also people being displaced from energy projects being built on their land, that these multinationals will just push people off and they're supported by the governments. Also people who can't make a living farming anymore, and then are, I guess, would be like classed as economic migrants rather than refugees, but also, on the way to being a refugee, there's a lot of situations where just people can't make a living anymore. Their land is becoming less habitable, and there aren't, that I know of, mechanisms of holding the historically and currently more polluting countries accountable for this. In fact, it's those countries supporting Frontex and making this perfect circular system of making more work for Frontex to do and justify. Anyway, so I think this kind of accountability and bringing the refugee crisis into the narrative about climate, so it doesn't become, I think it's much more useful to target them together and to join this work together than see it as two very separate pillars. And there's this huge irony in that while movement for people and refugees is becoming much more difficult, movement for fossil fuels is becoming easier and easier. With gas, for example, we're seeing a push for LNG terminals, where it used to be more based on pipelines and regional relationships and commitments between countries, and now they want to have this very free trade model where with ports that can import and export gas, and so it can just flow around the world. So the borders for the international trade is becoming much looser and freer, while the movement of people is becoming much harsher for those most in need. With the second question, I mean, it can be a long story. Why does gas have such an impact on climate change? But in a super fast way, less carbon is emitted when it's burnt than oil and coal, about half. Half is still a lot. And then gas is methane, which is a supercharged greenhouse gas. That's what's being burnt. And from extraction, transporting, burning, it's never a perfect closed system. It always leaks. There's study after study after study that it always leaks, and it's always, the studies show it leaks even more than we thought before. And methane is extremely heating in the short term, which makes us move faster towards irreversible tipping points. For example, Arctic ice melting, and then that tips, that changes current systems and things like that. So it's also just different to CO2. CO2 is less warming over a very long time frame. It's like a radiator, and methane like a hot water bottle, more intense, immediate heat, and carbon dioxide. Anyway, so more details we can talk about later, but there's also, do you think that hydrogen and clean energies also have an impact on geopolitics? Of course. As I said, hydrogen is used as a smokescreen, as a kind of greenwashing tactic to promote what in reality will be mostly fossil fuel projects. And so it's just something to really understand, do the research. I'm happy to, if anyone wants to be in contact with people who are really working a lot on hydrogen, I'm happy to. I think it's a very big danger and a trap that will lock us into more years of fossil fuels if we're not very careful with making hydrogen energy be really clean hydrogen, not hydrogen produced with fossil fuels for 30 years. And then 30 years from now, maybe they're ready to make it with solar energy. And with clean energies, there's also impacts on geopolitics. I mean, there's a massive industrial wind farms pushing people off their land, and with aggressively mined lithium for the batteries. And communities are resisting these. They're not what people want. They're not, that's not a holistic change that'll make the some numbers better. Governments can pat themselves on the back for their renewable targets. But as Alain just said, it's about managing the power of corporate multinationals. So yeah, real energy solutions can't be based on the centralized, extraction-based, exploitive model, and that includes renewable energies.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And thank you to all panelists. Today, we celebrated the last of the 4 webinars on the Southern neighborhood. You will have access to all materials in sglobal.es. All the information that we have gathered is there. And like this, you will be able to build a new agenda, new policies for the Southern neighborhood on equal footing, without conflicts, respecting human rights, promoting social justice, and creating an environmental and feminist agenda. So we hope to be able to present all of these conclusions in another event in autumn, to which you are all invited. Thank you very much. This is the end of this webinar. See you soon. Let's stay in touch.